You're too old. So. Anyway, I guess that put me into a midlife crisis, and I've never gotten over it. But again, we're so thankful. Be praying for our military. We're so blessed. We're so privileged as citizens of this great country. All right, let's take our Bibles and turn to Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1. Last week we took time off from our Galatians series in order to just kind of think and meditate on communion and what that was all about, as we were privileged to partake of that last week. And the week before that we had a missionary with us, and so it's been a little while since we've been in our Galatians series, and hopefully it's not something that you've forgotten about. It's such a powerful book, and again we titled the series Gospel-Centered Living. And as you see here, is the Apostle Paul is very adamant about the gospel, very passionate about the gospel, and as the song was just played, "It is well," that would have been Paul's theme song. It is well with my soul, and what a truth that is for each of us who have been saved and born again by the marvelous, mighty power of God. If you're able to stand, would you stand with me as we begin here reading from Galatians chapter 1, verse number 10. And again, our whole focus is through verse number 24, but we won't do all of these verses this morning. We'll just do a portion of them, and we'll read those now. "For do I now persuade men, or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. For ye have heard of my conversation in time past, in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, and called me by his grace, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood." Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the Word of God. Thank you for this incredible testimony that Paul is giving regarding his personal relationship with you, with the encounter that he had with you. Father, we thank you so much for the truth of the gospel. Thank you for the power of the gospel and how it affects and impacts lives. So God, I pray now that you will bless our hearts as we open your word together. Speak to us, teach us, instruct us through your word by your Spirit working in us. I pray and ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. So as we're looking at this passage, and especially at the entire book of Galatians, we are reminded that Paul had two main thoughts as he gets this book to the hands of the Galatians. What are they? Number one, it is the defense of his apostolic ministry. Right? And Paul made that very clear that, hey, the things that I'm speaking to you, I'm not speaking because I want to. I'm not speaking because you want me to. I'm speaking because I have to. God has commissioned me. He has called me to do this, and I must obey my commander-in-chief. And Paul gave a great defense as to why the Galatian believers should listen to him and not to these false teachers who have crept in. The second thing that Paul does, not only a defense of his apostolic ministry, but a defense of the gospel, which is by faith in Jesus Christ. And Paul makes that very clear. And throughout the study of the entire book of Galatians, those two thoughts are just constantly interwoven throughout the entire book. And so it's going to come from a standpoint of, okay, if you want to be saved, you've got to be saved by faith. And if you aren't saved by faith, then you're going to live and walk by faith. And that's going to be the end of the book. And so Paul is very clear. This is serious, serious business. And what has happened to the church or the churches of Galatia is absolutely incredible. And Paul started in that passage where he says, I marvel, I can't believe that you have been so quickly removed from the truth. And then Paul comes to this passage now, starting in verse number 10. And I've titled the message, Results of Radical Redemption. When you got saved, what happened? I struggle. I truly struggle with people who say they've been saved, but yet there's absolutely no change in their life. There's no difference between them and an unsaved person, meaning this. They think the same way. They do the same things. Their goals are the same as an unregenerate person. And I sit there and in all reality I just question and I struggle with, okay, has this person really been genuinely saved? Now it doesn't matter whether a person was saved as a 4 or 5-year-old to a 50-year-old. There's still going to be some things that are going to be different about his life and the life of an unbeliever. Now that does not mean that there aren't unbelievers out there who aren't nice people. It doesn't mean that unsaved people out there can't be kind and can't be generous. Listen, generosity and kindness and goodness are not necessarily just simple characteristics of saved individuals. Now certainly we as believers ought to be those things. But that's not necessarily the identifying mark of a believer. And so what Paul is going to bring up today as we study this and through the message next week, Paul is going to just really hit on this aspect of what does it mean to really be radically saved. Now, Paul is writing to believers. And Paul is saying, how can you be so quickly removed from the truth? Just look at these people who have come in and who are preaching to you now this false doctrine. Do you not see their lives and what they're like versus my life? Now I realize that we can look at Paul and we say, oh man, what a pompous jerk. Who does he think he is? I mean, what a goody two-shoe, right? I mean, this guy, man, he is so proud and so arrogant. He's so haughty and high-minded. No, Paul's whole boasting here is in the work of Jesus Christ in his life. And Paul is saying, he truly has made a difference in my life. And for every single born-again Christian, we ought to say the same thing. And the things that Paul is going to bring up in the rest of these verses should be the same results in our life. As a believer in Jesus Christ, Paul is going to bring out the results of the radical redemption we have in and through Jesus Christ. Now we have to understand what's going on here. You see, what's happening is the people were blaming Paul for a lot of wicked vices. They're blaming him. They're showing or trying to display that Paul is this he's just way out there. I mean, this is kind of weird, some of the things that are going, and Paul was saying, no, I'm going to tell you the reason why I'm way out there is because of the work of Jesus Christ in my life. Well, you know, they've done that with John the Baptist, did they not? Did it not say that about Jeremiah? Did it not say that about Isaiah? Did it not say that about Elijah? The answer is yes. You see, when God gets a hold of our lives, things change. So notice what Paul speaks about. Again, we'll look at three things, two this morning and one next week. First of all, notice radical redemption results in a radical change. A radical change in my life. Again, it doesn't matter whether I'm 5 years old or whether I'm 50 years old when I got saved. There's a radical change. There's a radical difference. Notice what Paul says here again starting in verse number 10. Paul says, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. For ye have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jewish religion." What was that like, Paul? How that I, beyond measure, I persecuted the church of God and wasted it. And I profited in the Jews' religion above many of my equals, my own nation being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. What does Paul say? Paul comes out and he's saying, listen, I want you to understand something. When Jesus Christ gets a hold of your life, things change. It changes, and it makes a huge difference, a radical change. That's why I said before, sometimes I question about people's testimony because I sit there and say, wait, where's the change? Where's the difference that Christ makes in one's life? And notice, Paul is going to point out three changes of his life. First of all, this radical change or life included, number one, a new and a distinct motive. A new and a distinct motive. Meaning this, why I do what I do. And we could ask a million questions in those thoughts, right? Number one, why are you here? Why are you here right now? What's the motive behind your presence this morning? Why are you here? Or, why do you read the Bible? Why? Why? Why do you pray? Why do you treat people the way you do? Which should be what? Passionate, tender, giving and forgiving. Right? The list just goes on. Why? Why do we, and Paul is going to talk about this motive behind him. What's driving him? So Paul begins in verse number 10. And he comes to this place. Again, remember, these are people that are blaming Paul for some false things. They're saying things about him that are untrue. And so Paul poses two questions to them. Comes to the fact and he says, listen, what do I now persuade men or God? And number two, do I seek to please men? What do you think I'm doing? And why do you think I'm doing those things? What is it actually behind this? Paul is very clearly going to express the fact that Paul sought to please God and God alone. That's why he does what he does. Am I just sitting here trying to persuade men, or am I trying to persuade God? Do I seek to please men, or am I trying to seek to please God? And then Paul answers it with what? For if I yet pleased men, then I should not be the servant of Christ. And again, what is Paul's whole thing? Two thoughts that are going throughout the entire book. His defense of his apostolic ministry and defense of the gospel, which is by faith in Jesus Christ alone, right? And so Paul is saying, listen, I should not be the servant of Christ if all I'm seeking to do is please men. In essence, you know these false teachers that are in your church right now? You know these false teachers that are going around and saying things against me and about me? You know what? They are seeking to please men. Now, I realize that Paul is bringing something up here that I will be honest with you about, and that is all of us struggle with being men pleasers. We all struggle. We struggle with the fact that we come to a place and we say, well, you know what? I wonder what they think about me if I did this. I wonder what they would think about me if I don't do this. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily everything about that is bad per se. Because, let's say, for example, you desire to please your spouse. Now, let me ask you, do you think God is pleased by that when you please your spouse? The answer is, of course, yes. But as long as it's in truth, and as long as it's right. I mean, if you said, well, you know what, I want to please my wife today by taking her on the nicest, grandest vacation this world could ever see. Well, the only way I can afford to do that is if I rob the bank. Right? Well, I want to please my wife, and Pastor said that I should try to please my wife. And then you make me form a prison ministry. Right? Yeah, we've got to keep it in context. I mean, the whole point is what? We want to please God. I want God to be pleased with my life. Now, does that mean that it will always please other people? The answer is no. Sometimes it may not even please my spouse. Sometimes it may not please my parents. Sometimes it may not please my kids. I had a teenager one time that I was working with, and he said, you know, Pastor, he said, my parents don't want me to go to church anymore. They're not saved. I got saved, and I want to be in church. But my parents don't want me to come to church anymore. Whew. I said, how do you handle that? I don't know. I'm not sure if I gave the right counsel. I said, who cares what your parents say? Just obey God. Now as a parent, I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Right? But I mean, you know, there are things that we have to understand, but the bottom line is what? We ought to seek to please God with every single thing we do. Whether it's the thoughts we have, whether it's the words we speak or how we speak those words, the actions that we do, whatever we do. And Paul was coming to this place. Now notice how Paul states it. Listen, there's a key word that Paul uses here in verse number 10. Paul says, for if I yet pleased men. In essence, here's what Paul is saying. Since I used to please men as an adult, Paul says, you know what? I struggle with that. Who is he pleasing? Well, he was pleasing his religious leaders. We'll cover that in just a moment. But Paul is saying now, you know, listen, I want you to say this. For if I were still pleasing men, that I should not be the servant of Christ. And so in all essence, here's what Paul is stating. You can't be a true servant of Christ if you're a man pleaser. tendencies in us that say, well, you know what, I wonder if you do this, you think this way, then wow, you know what, somebody might not like it. So I'll change it a little bit. I'll soften the blow. You know, it's very easy for me to struggle with pleasing man when I get to the pulpit. I don't want to say this because it might offend so-and-so, or it might offend this, or it might, you know, oh man. Yeah, it's easy. The Apostle Paul spoke to Timothy about Timothy, you be very careful. When you get into that pulpit and you preach the Word of God, don't just get up there to tickle men's ears. It's what we like to hear. He says, oh no. Because there are going to be some things that you're going to preach that you have to preach. When you preach the whole counsel of God, that are going to make people very upset. You preach it. You preach truth. You preach it in love. It's easy for me to get around other pastors and compare notes. Not sermon notes, but compare, hey, what's going on in your church, what's going on in our church. You know, well, one of the topics that comes up, which I hate, I literally hate. Now, if I was in a church of 5,000, maybe I wouldn't hate it. But, you know, it's always this. Well, how big is your church? How many you got? I said, well, we usually have between 800 and 900. Right? I didn't lie. We do. We have between 800 and 900 here this morning. Amen? Am I lying? No, I'm not. You guys are bad. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 right there. We have at least 8. And all the way up, do we have between 800 and 900? Yes! Right? And why do we do that? Well, because we want to please men. You know, and that happens in so many things, so many different facets of life. And so Paul is just consumed with this fact to make sure that as he begins this, he says, listen, I want you to understand the radical change in my life is that I have a new motive. There's a different reason why I do things. I want to please Christ. Number 2, not only a new and a distinct motive, but there's a new and a distinct message. When Christ comes into my life, there is a new and a distinct message. Notice what Paul says beginning in verse number 11. Paul says, but I certify you, brethren, that the gospel, remember, that which you have so quickly removed yourself from, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. Paul is saying that I have been a recipient of a very clear revelation. This is not of man. He proclaimed the gospel, yet they entered into the churches and what said Paul was preaching falsely. And Paul says, oh, no. The gospel that I preached to you was not of man. This was by direct revelation of and from Jesus Christ. This is not a man-made message. This is a message that came from Jesus Christ unto you. So it's not a figment of Paul's imagination. This was not a doctrine of his theological seminary. This was what? Directly from Jesus Christ. What is the gospel? Well, we've already talked about it. We've already studied it in this text. And that is what? It's the good news of Jesus Christ saving an individual through the death, the burial, and his resurrection. What does that mean? That means I can live a life of freedom. I can be free not only from the penalty of my sin, but I can be free from an active lifestyle of sin. God wants to free me of these things. And that's the gospel. That's the good news, that I do not have to live unto my sinful flesh any longer. This is a different message. Paul comes to this place and he says, I want you to understand how important this message is. It truly changes our life. This is by revelation of Jesus Christ, not of man. Notice what he says in verse number 12. Paul says, for I neither received it, that is, again, the gospel, of man, neither was I taught it, that is, of man, not necessarily by man, but though he's going to make that distinction clear later on in the text, and we'll deal with that next week. But what? I received this by the revelation of Jesus Christ. That word revelation, we just came out of our series in the book of Revelation, which is what? The unveiling, the unmasking of this truth. Jesus Christ is the one who revealed it to me. And so Paul says, listen, this radical change in my life gives me a new motive, gives me a new message. Thirdly, it gives me a new and a distinct manner of life. A new and a distinct manner of life. In verse number 13, Paul says, for ye have heard of my conversation. That word conversation is an old English word meaning lifestyle or manner of life. Right? It's what you and I would say today, right? You live what you say, right? Or your walk should match your talk. Right? That's the idea of this word conversation. It's your lifestyle. Your life is constantly conversing, if you will. It's constantly speaking. So Paul says, listen, you have heard of my former manner of life. What was his former manner of life? Notice what he says. In time past, in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure, I persecuted the church of God. Paul says, listen, I want you to understand what has happened, what transpired in my life. You know what I used to be like as a person in the Jews' religion. What was it about his life? I persecuted the church of God. Why? Now, I want you to understand. As an unbelieving Jew, Paul or Saul, I should refer to him so you understand the former conversation, the former person, Saul believed he was doing God's will. So what do you do? Don't answer. If it is for me, just let them know I'm busy right now. So what is this former conversation? What was his life like? It was what? It was this aspect of making sure that, hey, these people of the way, these new people, they are wrong, they are dead wrong, they are ruining what God has told Abraham and his followers to do and to be. Can I just say, this past week, or it's actually been a couple of weeks ago, I just heard Louis Farrakhan, who said this: it is God's will for us to destroy the infidels, which would be to make people can I just say this? Please don't take this the wrong way. What he believes is what? God's will. He was speaking in, I believe it was in Iran. And, he got up and he's making this eloquent speech. And this is what God's will for us as Muslims is to do. Paul is stating the same thing. And so what did he do? He persecuted the church, and he did what? He wasted it. Hey, these people that are coming past me, are you one of these followers of Jesus? Remember who Jesus was to the Jews? He's a blasphemer. Hey, you're a follower of that blasphemer? Hey, we're going to kill you. If not kill you, then we'll at least persecute you. And if we don't persecute you, we'll imprison you. Yeah, you guys are wrong. Isn't it amazing that that's what religion does? You say, what about us as Christians? What is the will of God for us? To hate everyone who disagrees with us. To murder them, to persecute them, to imprison them, right? That's what we do. And as independent Baptists, that's what we do. Right? No, I need to make sure I clean this up and clear this up, because people will walk out here thinking, that's what I heard, and it'll be all over the news networks and all they'll get the audio and the video and all this. But no, here's the point. God calls us to love people, even our enemies. But other religions, no. You persecute and you waste them. Some people ask, well, how do I know Christianity is right? Well, there's one reason. There are many other reasons. But God changed Saul's life. And so he says, listen, you know what I was like. And here's how excited I was about it. I profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in my own nation. Right? Jews, he's speaking of their language, their religious practices, and then his nation here, which was an Israelite, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. Paul was a prime example of self-righteousness before his conversion. He was doing everything the wrong way. There are a lot of people who are misguided. A lot of people in our world who are doing everything they think may be good, but it's the wrong way until Christ enters in. The person can be going to church all their life. Trying to do this, I'm trying to do this, I'm trying to do this. I want to be good. I want God to accept me the way that I am, and so I'm going to clean up my life. I'm going to do this and all that and everything. And even though it may be plausible, it may be something good, and what we might even look at and say valuable, the reality is what? They're lost until Christ comes in. Paul is stating here the radical change that Jesus Christ makes in my life. What a change. What a difference. And so Paul says, this is what's going on. You compare me with these false preachers, these false teachers in the church of Galatia. You just compare. We're radically different. Why? Because of the gospel. So Paul speaks, first of all, the radical change that comes from this radical redemption. Secondly, not only a radical change, but a radical call. A radical call. So Paul is writing and saying, listen, you know what manner of life was. You know what I was dealing with as a Jew in my religion, and what I was seeking to do to those who were of this way, those who were disciples of Christ, how I was going to persecute them and waste them, in which he did. God did something marvelous and miraculous in my life. And we can read about that in Acts chapter 9. We don't have time to do that. But Paul says, listen, there's something different about me now. Again, Pastor Nick's read for us earlier from 1 Timothy, where Paul speaks, hey, I'm so thankful that God put me into the ministry, who before was injurious, persecutor. The choir sang about the blood, and one of the verses there was Paul's testimony. I don't know if you caught it. I asked Don. I said, Don, did you plan that song? He said, no, I didn't plan it, but God did, right? And hopefully you caught that. And those of you who are in the choir, maybe you'll remember as things that you were singing about there. But Paul is saying, listen, here's something radical about my life. It's the call of God. So notice what Paul says. Verse number 15, or verses 15 and 16. Paul says, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace. Paul is not coming to the place here where he's speaking about his salvation, but about his service. When it pleased God. Wow. What is it that pleases God about your life? Paul's saying, here, let me tell you what pleased God. And that is placing me into the ministry. I remember clearly when I sensed God's call in my life. Now, I realize that it begins, as Paul would say, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desires a good thing. Listen, there's a difference between a desire and a call. Every single one of us should desire it. Should we not? I mean, I honestly believe the greatest profession on planet Earth is a pastor. It's also the hardest, I believe. We should desire it. I wish every young person would come up to me and say, Pastor, I want to be just like you. Now, okay, that's different, right? I want them to be like me. I remember when I was a youth pastor, I had teenagers that actually got their haircuts just like mine. They changed the way their hair was and said, I want to look like Pastor Norman. They wore their tie. I always do a single tie and or single knot, and I used to get them really, really small. And all of a sudden we see teenagers coming to church with super tight. It was all like choking. I can't talk, but I look like Pastor Norman, right? Hey, that's great. But I mean, isn't it great if all of our young people grew up and said, man, I want to be a pastor. Not the ladies, okay? But they can say, I want to be a pastor's wife, right? But wow, but there's something different when God calls. And Paul says, listen to what Paul says in verse number 15 again. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to do what? To reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen. Immediately, I conferred not with flesh. Paul is speaking of this radical call. He calls himself an apostle by calling. He also says that in Romans 1 and verse 1, 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 1. Paul called of God to this ministry. Now, the word calling can refer to two things. Paul is going to write to the Ephesian believers and speak about the call or the vocation that you are to walk worthy of. which is what? Your salvation. Walk worthy of that salvation. But Paul is speaking about here not his salvation, but his service. God's grace has separated him from his own self-righteousness and destruction. Right? He spoke about that in verse number 14. But when it pleased God, who separated me. Not only did God's grace separate him from his own self-righteousness, but it also separated him to then serve Christ. And the word separated here means to mark off from a boundary or a line. Right? Maybe you have done that. You spray painted something in your yard. And you have made a boundary. Hey, this is where you can go. This is what you can do. Don't go outside of this. That's what God is saying. This is what God has separated me unto. Notice when? From my mother's womb. From my mother's womb. How? What in the world is that? You mean, okay, so God has this distinct call before the person is even born? Well, there are several people in the scriptures that refer to that. Samson, Jeremiah, Paul, John the Baptist. Right? I mean, this well, what does that mean? I want you to be very careful. This call does not mean that God saved him before Paul had any inclination towards the gospel. Some people think that, oh, okay, so Paul was just automatically saved. No, look what Paul did. He persecuted the church. He killed Christians. Paul, even in his testimony, there at Stephen's martyrdom. Well, that was all just part of God's will for his life. God wanted him to kill some Christians before he came to faith in Christ, right? No. No, it's not what that means. It means what? That there are people whom God has placed a call on their life who have refused it, who have rejected it, who have perhaps been murdered before it happened. I have no doubt believing that there are many people in our society today, or many people who have been killed, whether it be through abortion or some other means, that God had a plan for their life. Yet they missed out on it because they didn't heed the call. This was not a guarantee for salvation. If that was the case, then why didn't God save him back when he was a young boy? Because Paul was probably most likely born somewhere near the time of Jesus Christ, when Jesus was doing his public ministry. He may have been present, listening, and heard Jesus when he was just a little tyke. God could have saved him back then and prevented him from going in this Jews' religion where he would then eventually persecute those of the way. This was not a call to salvation. God had a call in his life and a plan for his life. And Paul, if you just come and you follow this way, and you follow this path, then it will be revealed to you, and you will be my servant. So let's look here at what this means. So Paul says here several things about this call on his life, or this call in his life. First of all, it tells us, Paul says that he was called by grace when it pleased God. And he called me by his grace. What an incredible call. By his grace. This wasn't because Paul was such a great person. It wasn't because Paul was such a great speaker. It's not because Paul was the smartest individual in the room. This was all of God's grace. Secondly, God also called him to do what? To reveal his Son. God wants believers to know Christ and then to make him known. You realize that is God's call for each of us and God's desire for each of us. Thirdly, we also understand this, that God called Paul to preach Christ. To reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen. Not only does God want to work in my own heart, but God wants to work in my heart so that he can work in other people's hearts through me. That's a radical call. It's not about me, it's all about Christ. God wants me to reveal him to people that I come in contact with. So the question we could ask ourselves right now, is my life impacting other people's lives for eternity? Certainly we understand from earlier in the passage, God called Paul to seek his gospel from God alone. Right, this, back in verse 11, certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man, neither received it of man. Right? And then he says in verse 16, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. I didn't go to other people to try to figure this thing out. I went to God and God alone. Paul is then going to share with us in chapter 2 later on how he did that for 3 years. He got alone with God, if you will, in the seminary school of God and God alone. So Paul is writing, Paul is saying, listen, I want you to understand, folks, how this God radically changed my life. He called me to serve him and to preach him among the heathen, among the nations, and you guys were a part of that. So how can you have so quickly removed yourself from this? Why would you do that? Start heeding false doctrine. Oh, may God help. May God help us. So as we look at this, next week we'll then look at the third part of this passage, verses 17 to 24. And we'll talk about a radical commitment. A radical commitment. What does it mean now to be a believer in Christ who is sold out to him? Well, we'll see that in our study next week. And so as we close this morning, I wonder, are you or am I a man pleaser? I'm just seeking to please man. I'm just after what I think, what I want, what other people want in my life or from my life, and how do I impact them, and all these things. Do I seek to please men, or am I seeking to please Christ? Because if I seek to please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. It was what called us. So I ask us the second question. Am I seeking to please Christ to others? Father, we thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the truth of that word. God, thank you for this incredible redemption that we have in Jesus Christ and what it means to be a believer in Christ, and how Christ radically makes things different. God, thank you for the salvation that you provide through your Son, Jesus Christ. And Father, it is truly our desire here that people that we come in contact with would not only see the truth lived out in our lives, but that they would also hear the truth. We'd be willing to speak forth the Word of God into the lives of other people. Father, I pray that you'll help each and every one of us, Lord, to examine, as my power of it. Thank you for the purpose of it. Father, I pray that each and every one of us, God, would